of all, as many of you know, we have received by email some reminders about the V Oscars, which is now virtual this year for the very first time. Will be held on September 17th, and tickets are free to come on to this online event. So we want all of you definitely to show your support by attending and sharing with your organizations and your volunteers to have them attend. And of course, you can nominate volunteers. Volunteer NBC member organizations can nominate in various categories. There's actually 14 different categories, some for individuals, some for groups, and even for leaders of volunteers like many of you. And also board directors. So there are certainly a number of categories, and you can review the categories on our website and submit a nomination at the links visible there, bit.ly/Vosker nomination, or register and get your ticket at the ticket website. If you are interested in serving on our judging committee at the next edition of the awards, which would be actually happening in December at our Peel Cares, where we present the Volunteer of the Year awards, we are going to be looking for some new judges to join the judging committee. So you can reach out to me and to get more information on that. Later on, we'll be next couple of weeks working to dig deeper into a volunteer screening, and so we're reaching out for a couple of people who would want to help us in a volunteer screening working group, because we ran a previous forum on screening and had expressed at that time a question whether people would be interested in kind of digging deeper into really coming up with an optimized screening process the volunteer centers could support with. And so if you're interested in potentially learning more about that, to reach out to me. And then finally, there are many different things that organizations are doing now, some that were part of your operations already, and some of you that have pivoted to offer some essential services, or you may be aware of clients or other people in the community who you feel could benefit from some support with essentials. So what we're doing is working with numerous organizations to help coordinate them and ensure that the resources are distributed effectively, we find efficiencies and make it easier for organizations to work together. So we're calling that the continuum of care. So if you want to learn more about that, you can also reach out to us or email me. My email address is provided up there, and I'll repeat all of these links in the chat in case you want to be able to click on them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And with that, we get into our main topic, and it's about privacy and data security. And I would like to invite Konstantin Kabaliotis, who's a lawyer by profession for over 17 years, both in the domestic and the international arenas. He has acted as a privacy officer and leader of two multinational organizations, helping their clients to build effective programs for various compliance-related legislations, as well as he maintains numerous certifications. And also, we have the privilege of his support in the education of privacy and data security. With that, Konstantin, can I hand over the session to you? You could take over and share your presentation.
Certainly. Thank you, Sharminda, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak. I will now hopefully get my presentation up on your screens. And, oh, sorry, things are happening on the screen, so I'm just trying to get control again. And there we are. And I'll just minimize these and put this in presentation mode. Do you see the title screen?
There may be a little bit of lag time, Konstantin, so if you give it about a second or two.
Okay.
We don't see it as yet, but we see your screen.
Okay. Let me see what. I'll try that again. Now do you see it?
Not as yet.
Okay, you know what? It's decided because I have multiple monitors to play games with me as to which one it's showing. So what do you see currently?
Just your circular icons in CK.
Okay. Okay, let me try this again. This time, I'm going to choose to share the whole desktop because that. And
There we
now,
go.
okay, all right. So choosing Windows is not a good idea. Okay, so again, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I, did initiate this looking for some sort of way to support. In this particularly at this time, I think it's important to reach out and to be helpful to people. And of course, the thing that I do, which is privacy. Well, that's the thing I'm best at talking about. I do teach through continuing education at the University of Toronto. I've been involved for a number of years in teaching through the professional association I belong to, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And I like teaching. And it's my way of, I hope, contributing and helping you in the goals that you have in supporting the individuals that you need to help. And I do want to make sure that this is open for conversation. I'm not don't want to just simply be a talking head. So if you do have questions, pop them through the chat, or alternatively, and Shaminda, I may ask for your help in just monitoring that because I may not see, given what's on my screen right now, the questions, or whoever else who's moderating. Sorry, and that well, with that, I'll just start. And I will say that one of the things that we have to appreciate in privacy is that we're still at the beginning to a great extent for many organizations, not just in social purpose organizations, but in the business community, of understanding what it is to do privacy properly. Everyone is happy saying we're in the information age, but we really haven't spent a lot of time in that sort of mode, and we don't really, I think, have built into the culture of organizations how data should be treated. It's easy to look at a bunch of electrons. You can't look at electrons, but treat a bunch of electrons as not having any value. And that's ironic because, of course, that's where most of the value in many organizations are today, is in the information that they hold and not in their physical assets at all. And yet we still lag behind, I think, treating information in a way that would, sort of be comparable to, say, how we treat cash or how we treat physical assets. So we are at the beginning, and it's important, however, because you can see just from the media the number of opportunities that there are for things to go wrong. You hear it and see it all the time now. It's almost continuing news stories about breaches, about people's frustration with how information is being used or shared. And so, but there are some basic things that all organizations can do that are not overly challenging. A lot of this is, I hate to say it, just common sense. Where privacy is really about treating people with respect and making common sense decisions about protecting and use of data. So I'll go on and we'll hopefully get to some useful details about how you can be doing that in your organizations. But let's start first of all with a key definition. What is personal information? Because that is really what we're talking about. And the definition I like most about privacy is that it relates to the individual's ability to control the use and disclosure of information. It's really about control and who is actually permitted to use the information. Of course, we can't do what we need to do in order without actually sharing information, right? The only really secure personal data is one that's on a server buried in concrete in somewhere that everyone's forgotten. But of course, it can't be used, can't be actually used to support the individuals that you want, can't be used to support business, for instance. So we have to make decisions about how information is to be protected, given we have the expectation we're going to use that data. And it also means control over intrusions. I'm sure everyone here has experienced the calls at dinner time, to either sell you ductwork services or other kinds of, calls. And, we find them aggravating. We find them intrusions. We don't want them. We want to be able to control what comes into our hands. And it's also important to remember personally identifiable information is very widely, it's almost a circular definition. It can be anything that can be used to identify an individual or relates to an identifiable individual. And so these are just meant as examples, right? It's very broad. And the even information, for instance, in a phone book, even though it's published, is personal information. Of course, the sensitivity of it is very low because it's been published in a phone book, but it's still personal information. What's not personal information? Well, information relating to organizations, corporations, and non-governmental organizations are not people and don't have privacy. They may have confidentiality obligations. Obviously there's information that you need to keep secure for a number of reasons, but they are not people and therefore don't have privacy. Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, let's talk about the law a bit. So PIPEDA, which is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, applies to commercial activities in Canada. And it has been applied to mean that where charities, for instance, use third parties for fundraising activities, that they can be drawn into that definition of commercial activity. So that's something to be careful of because you will often heard said, charities don't have a law directly governing them in relation to privacy, and that's true. There is still, however, some application of laws, especially as I say, when you get into fundraising activities, which you may have outsourced to, say, a third party. In the case of Castle, that does apply to many organizations, especially, and I'm sure you've had to deal with, getting consent from individuals in order to continue emailing them. Castle is the Canadian anti-spam legislation. It's intended to ensure that people are not being spammed, frankly. There are provincial laws in Alberta, BC, and Quebec that govern privacy. But only BC's governs nonprofit entities. So if you're doing anything in relation to British Columbia, you need to be conscious of that. There are also public sector laws, and that can have an impact on social purpose organizations as well, because often work is done under contract or in association with governmental agencies. And through those arrangements, you'll find that, for instance, Ontario's Freedom of Information Privacy Protection Act, or MFIPA, which is a municipal equivalent, also may apply to you. So it's important to be conscious of where these obligations may be coming from, because they are not always due simply to the law. You might say would be coming from a law that designated specifically for charities. Now, there are also extraterritorial applications, and this you need to appreciate is increasingly important because we have this notion that the rules follow the data. So, for instance, European law applies to the information relating to European residents, whether it's being collected in Europe or it's being collected from over the internet in, say, North America. Canadian law applies equally. PIPEDA applies to commercial organizations gathering data from Canadians outside of Canada. Now, there's always a challenge with enforcement, but still those laws apply. And you might find if you're doing work with, for instance, organizations in other countries, and I was, had done a presentation for a charity supporting orphans in a Latin American country, they also had to comply with the laws in that country when gathering or using personal information. Sorry, I'm just seeing the questions now. I just brought it up on another screen. Does PIPEDA apply to volunteer programs? No, it does not, because you're not engaged in a commercial activity. But I'm going to come back to some broader thinking about that. Does a good terms and conditions or terms of service agreement provide protection to agencies? Usually, and this is similar to what happens in the for-profit area, there will often be a terms of use or terms of service that links to a privacy notice or a privacy statement. And you would incorporate it by reference so that whether it's volunteers or the individuals that you're supporting will understand that the information that's being gathered and used will be um, used consistently with that privacy notice. So I think I've answered the questions, and so you can mitigate some of the risks associated with collecting and processing data by, and this is really important, telling people what you're going to do. I'm going to summarize all privacy for you in basically one sentence, and I'm not going to be able, unfortunately, to claim this brilliance because I got it from somebody else over LinkedIn. And this was said in relation to the European law, but it's true in general. Privacy is about doing what you say you're doing, saying what you're doing, and being able to prove it. There you are. So really, transparency and honoring your commitments to people when you make them is really critical. And that is the basis of respect and of trust, right? Telling people what you're doing, being able to prove it, being able to have some basic rules in place as to how you're governing and managing personal information, and just adhering to it. So let's go on, because we also want to talk about that concept of notice and consent, because when you actually put out a notice, you are actually making a deal with the world. You're saying this is how we're going to use the information, and then that creates an expectation. And this won't apply to you, but Facebook recently was fined $9 million by the Competition Bureau because they were not honoring what they said they were honoring or doing in their privacy notice. So you see, increasingly that contract with the world is quite important. You'll and it's not enough to have a 4,000 word privacy notice you can't read on a little tiny screen on our phones. You have to actually communicate what is it you're doing, right? You have to just be straight with people. I mentioned before that funding and support is often conditioned on compliance with protection of personal information. So you may have public sector privacy laws imported through those arrangements. But what it boils down to is this. It's reputational and it's social. It's a global expectation. I'm sure all of you got emails about 2 years ago when the European law went into effect. Do we have your consent to continue writing to you? And this happened during Castle. And increasingly people are aware around the world what privacy is and what their expectations should be. And interestingly, when Microsoft was implementing what it was doing to support European compliance, it decided basically it was going to treat everybody the same, which is also a good strategy. And where did they get most of their information requests from? The United States, where there are no privacy, broad private sector privacy laws. And so you see, there is this expectation now that is becoming increasingly common and global as to how information is going to be managed. And confidence and trust, of course, is built on treating people with respect. You don't want to have unusual or unexpected consequences, but also, and this has happened, that you don't want to be the reason somebody introduces a law, right? Oftentimes breaches, particularly in the US and other countries, have been the reason why laws have been introduced. When in the US, employers started demanding for social media accounts, usernames and logins, so they could check what their employees were saying and doing on Facebook, for instance, states immediately started passing laws prohibiting it, right? And you don't want to be the reason, that a law is introduced, and you don't want to be on the front page of a newspaper for a privacy violation, because of course, you support from your volunteers, support from sponsors and donors, and in fact, the morale of one's staff, one's employees, is really contingent on, again, treating them with, respect. So beyond law, there is doing the right thing. So, and this is really now coming to the fore. I've said to many people that this pandemic situation is really a test of character, for indi- oh, not just for individuals, but for organizations. And by organizations, I mean they actually have in place the right structures to protect information in the first place. Because now in those weaknesses in privacy programs are going to come to the fore. And they're going to come to the fore, and I, am also fully expecting to be quite busy over the next 24 months with the consequences of the fact that people are gathering and doing more gathering while without appropriate protections in place, but have shifted this model to working from home. So, are they keeping it safe in their homes? Do they lock sensitive documents in filing cabinets? Do they shred? Are they sharing the computer? Do they have antivirus and other software to protect their computers? And are we getting information about people who might be ill, whether they're employees or volunteers or clients? If you don't have a notion of how you're ensuring that it's shared only with the people who need to see it, then you're going to just now be adding to that stockpile of information and not having the right processes in place to protect them. So, in returning to the office, measuring temperatures, what do you do with that information concerning illness? Who are you sharing it with? How long are you retaining it? That's a big weakness I see in many Canadian organizations. We are pack rats. We don't get rid of data, and because we might need it later. And there are retention periods and retention policies for a reason. What you don't have when there's no longer a legal or business reason to retain information. Getting rid of data is a great de-risking exercise, right? Don't keep what you don't have the obligation to retain. So, and also, who are you sharing it with? I mean, particularly for social purpose organizations, there is sharing back and forth with potentially government agencies, but other social purpose organizations. You've got to really think about what information sharing is appropriate and how much should be done, and is there a valid basis for it? So, excuse me, some of the activities that you may be wanting to think about. So, collection of information about donors through third-party organizations, as I mentioned, could potentially bring you under PIPEDA. So that means that you're going to have to be very clear about the uses of that information and understand that there is potential there for fines as well as investigations from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And this applies whether it's done online or through events. You've got to be careful about promotion. The sharing images of vulnerable individuals, particularly minors. And this can happen very easily. I mean, one, has an event and we put pictures online and, on social media. And it's one thing to do it for your own purposes, your own individual, personal, socialization. But it's quite another when you're doing it in the context of an organization. You have to be conscious of that, making sure people are aware that those images are being gathered, for instance. And so what we see, for instance, at events is, a sign that might be put up saying, these, photographs will be taken. If you don't want your photograph taken, please let us know. So that, again, people are given a choice. Again, privacy is largely about choice. Testimonials are another source of potential information. You want to be clear when you're gathering them how they're going to be used. And I've already mentioned how data can apply internationally, particularly where you're supporting people who are, for instance, coming from other countries, or you're supporting activities that may be doing fundraising for um, uh, things that are happening in those countries. How is that information being gathered there, and its transmission to Canada? That country's law still applies, and it will apply equally the other way if you're sending Canadian data to outside of Canada. So some recommendations, right? And this doesn't require that you go and make, a monster project involving, a great deal of time. Sometimes it's just very simple, and putting into a spreadsheet, what data are we gathering? And how, that's what I mean by data inventory. The first step, and curiously, many organizations can't actually tell you what data they have, is to know what data you've got. You can't protect what you don't know. And you sometimes are surprised by the information gathering that's actually taking place when you, peel back, the layers of it. So conduct a data inventory. What information are you getting? And how is it moving through your hands and into the hands of other parties? Just drawing it out on a whiteboard can be very helpful to understand where risks can potentially arise. So you develop some policies. They've got to be appropriate for the size of the organization and the risks of the data, right? If and keep it simple, because complex policy structures are risky. They don't get complied with. Keeping things simple will help, especially when you're dealing with lots of people who are coming in and out potentially as volunteers, to make it simple for them to actually do the right things. Something Shaminda is really excited about is my emphasis is going to be a lot in this is about training and awareness, right? I often make the comment that despite the fact we're in the information age, that many people are effectively leaving the key in the front door. They don't realize what risks they're taking on. Everyone says they care about privacy. We do. But if you don't understand how to protect it, then of course, that's going to be the first problem. And education is the first best mitigation against risk, because you need people to understand their responsibility in regards to protecting people's information, and emphasize it. You can't expect people to comply with a policy you've put on a website or have gotten a locked filing cabinet. You have to teach it. Look at how information is obtained in your organization. Do you have consents that are appropriate for the actual data that you're gathering? And especially if you're dealing with minors, making sure that, or other individuals who may not be able to give legal consent, to make sure you've got that documented appropriately. Minimize. There's this principle that we try to encourage organizations to do, which is data minimization. And this is contrary to what everyone's been doing since the 1990s, when people were setting up websites in those days. In the early 2000s, we'd get name, address, mother's maiden name, shoe size, because we might need it later. Well, that's not a really good basis for gathering data. You get what you need in order to fulfill the function. I will say, just as an example, right? I went to the grocery store, and it was at Christmas time. And my wife had sent me to get some sour cream. And of course, it was the only thing we were missing. And of course, that was the worst time to be at the it was one of the big, I won't say who, grocery stores. And I was, in the 1 to 10 line. And it was for going out the door. And I finally got to the till, and the clerk asked me, for my postal code. And I said, no, I don't need to give you my postal code. I'm giving you cash. I don't want to give you my postal code. And she didn't know what to do. She said, well, I need your postal code because I can't process this otherwise. Now I'm that guy, right? That's holding up the line. So anyways, but this, despite that, I was going, no, I'm just, that's just wrong. And she finally went over to somebody else and said, well, he doesn't want to give me a postal code. And the other clerk said, well, you just hit enter and it'll go right through. So you see, that was a failure, first of all, training, right? They didn't really make it clear. But also, when you see a field, What is people's natural inclination? Well, we need it. We have to fill it. So think carefully when you're asking for information. Do we really need it? Because somebody will, filling in that form say always. It's not optional. It's also a failure of, interface design. It should have been clearly marked as optional, right? And because you can't, that was actually a violation of the law. PIPEDA requires that you not collect information to provide a good or service that's not needed for the delivery of that service or good without consent. And I wasn't consenting. So this are the kinds of things that you need to think about. How do we minimize data collection? Put the essentials of cybersecurity in place, right? There's got to be some practical things that we're going to go into right now about how we protect information. We're all working electronically. And like I said, we're leaving the key in the front door. Okay, so this is a fairly, a small text, but hopefully you'll follow along with me. Okay, so we've got some examples here of things that you can do. Most operating systems have built-in encryption. Turn it on. Whether it's a desktop or a laptop, a computer can be stolen. If you've got all sorts of personal data on a laptop or on a desktop computer and it goes missing, you have a breach. That's simple. This is particularly important with everybody working from home because we're often using home machines and we don't often think about doing that one thing, turning on, encryption. But it is built in on the Mac. It's built in under Windows. Ensure everyone has turned it on. With everyone working from home as well, there's often a computer, and it's a shared computer with the family. Well, no one should be accessing or be able to access the files that you have in your hands for your social purpose organization, right? So it's possible to set up separate user accounts. Often people don't bother to do that. That's a capability. You log in separately. Each person has a password. I drive my family nuts by making sure that they have, that's one thing I should have put on here as well, is have good passwords. Don't reuse passwords. Because if you lose the password, in a breach, then if you've used the same password for everything, you have now got everything exposed. Okay, this is good from a personal standpoint as well as from an organizational one. So I have different passwords. I use a password manager because my brain is not so good as I can remember 100 different passwords anymore. But you need to have different passwords and complex passwords for your computers. And you need to make sure that each person using that computer has their own account and password. That way you can ensure that the data that you're manipulating, using, emailing, is not accessible to others in your family. Another really key and important component is antivirus and anti-malware software, and I've listed some free ones. And you should have always have antivirus. There's fewer on the Mac, but you can always pass on a virus to somebody else on the PC side if you don't have this installed. But there are increasingly more viruses and malware affecting Macintoshes. And of course, they're always existed on the Windows side. Why do you want to do this? Well, especially if it's a family computer, sometimes, people will download stuff from sites they shouldn't. And you want to be very careful to make sure that your computer is not compromised because that's the way organizations, criminal organizations make money. They will hold your computer to ransom or your organization more dangerously by getting control, getting through you to your organization's network. So you're the weak point, frankly, in this exercise. You need to make sure you don't become an exposure to others by simply sending files around that have been infected, and thus either causing, corruption to your data, which is bad, but also what we see very commonly happening today is ransomware attacks, where the data that you need to operate is encrypted outside of your reach, and the attacker wants ransom in order to unlock it. And that is also critical when I say don't click on links or emails or open attachments unless you're expecting them. Phishing, which is not misspelled, it's the way we use that, is about getting you to click on a link that it looks like it's coming from your bank or it looks like it's coming from your telecom. And you've got to be very careful and look at the where it's actually coming from. Look at the email address. It's often made to look like a legitimate email, but if you look closely, it's often not. Also, banks, for instance, don't ask you to log in or confirm transactions and that sort of thing. And this is where the education part's really quite important, because no matter what kind of software or technology companies and organizations put in place, the individual is still the weak point. They can be conned into opening something that will cause losses. And that's, again, we go back to the education. USB sticks are the bane of everyone's existence. And some of the organizations I've worked for, they've turned off the ability to actually copy anything to a USB stick. So that's because of the risk associated with their being lost with all sorts of valuable data. So don't use USB sticks unless you encrypt them entirely. And you can buy, USB sticks that are, just will always encrypt whatever is put on them and password protect them. Or you can use some of the software that I've listed there to encrypt the files. It's not complicated. You just have to put in a password. And again, do not use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as the password. Use something reasonably complex. And that way, if the USB stick is lost, no big deal. What is a VPN? That's a virtual private network. And this is really important to understand, especially in the context of free wireless hotspots and so on. So when you connect to a hotspot, you're trusting that whoever set that up has got the right security in place. And frankly, since so many coffee shops, hotspots are run by teenagers, I'm not entirely sure of that. So a VPN encrypts the communication, say from your phone or your iPad or your computer, through the connection point that you're using. And that means that if that hotspot has been compromised by a bad guy, that they can't then pick up your passwords and your data as it's going through their hands, right? This is also important to remember about using your own Wi-Fi, right? Many times people pop it in and never check to see, have they got a password? Is it a good password or is it just the default? The default is often for many people's wireless systems is username admin, password admin. Okay, that's no good because that means that anyone can log into it. Okay, so you want to make sure that it's secured with a good password, both the administrative console as well as your wireless itself. Because Wi-Fi's, whether at home or at hotspots like coffee shops, hotels, wherever, are a opportunity for somebody to do what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. They can look at the data as it's going through that hotspot and compromise your information. Okay. I hate email. Email was never intended to send all sorts of sensitive data. It is not like sending a letter. It is like sending a postcard. And so unless you are encrypting the information, meaning take the file, use one of those free software programs, like if it's a Word or Excel document, encrypt it. And never, ever, this is for your own good as well as for your clients. If you're in communicating with your accountant to get your taxes done, should not go over the internet unless it's encrypted. Never send a social secure social insurance number. Never send any health information, health card numbers. Any government issued identifiers should always be encrypted. And the reason for that is it, again, is not in your control whose hands it flows through. So, and what's even worse, and I had to deal with this, I used to deal with privacy breaches under US law before Canada had its own breach requirements. And one of the things, a third of the time, breaches resulted from missent emails. That is really important to remember because it is human nature to make mistakes. But if you've encrypted the file, and hopefully you haven't sent the password along in the same message, then no one can get access to it. It's not a big deal. So this is why I emphasize, this is again, experience, at least a third of the incidents I had to deal with were missent emails. The best way to send information is if your organization has set up a mechanism through Google Drive or Dropbox or whatever to upload the file and tell the person it's there waiting for you, because that whole communication is encrypted and is therefore secure. But there's an important caveat. Don't use the free versions. Don't set up free. Use what the organization is requiring you to use, because the free versions are not really free. The potential, sorry, there's somebody speaking in the background. If you could just mute. So if you're going to, allow for sharing, make sure that it's something the organization has selected, right? And that everybody knows that's the only thing they're to use. Because when you're using the free version, first of all, you're accepting whatever contract or agreement they're providing, and often they are making provision for the fact that they themselves can use the data that you're uploading. And let's not forget that paper is still a big source of breach. A colleague of mine woke up in the middle of the night to see a van going by collecting stuff from blue boxes. It wasn't a city van. So why? Well, because there's value in personal data, and people just throw it away. So breaches often happen. Identity theft often happens from paper. So make sure that you have a crosscut shredder, or don't print it in the first place. Use Adobe Acrobat to sign documents, and then use those portals for sharing the documents. And Shaminda's pointed out to me that there is a resource available to you which provides for software which you can leverage. It's TechSoup, that can be used by your organization, so that when you're looking for making some investments in some of this stuff, it can actually be a little bit more economical. Okay, so more than ever, privacy is important. As I say, it's taken us a while, given we've been in the information age. But whether it's in the private sector or in social purpose organizations, trust is bought, it takes a long time to build, and it can be lost very quickly. And when you do good privacy, when you treat people with respect, it increases the trust they have with you and their willingness to share information with you. The crisis offers an opportunity to do a reset, to do a hard rethink about what it is that you're doing with people's data, and make sure that you can honor your commitments to them. Now, we have some time for Q&A. Some typical situations. I didn't actually put in, Shaminda, when I send you the this corrected version, I'll put in the link. There was a vendor breach recently, Blackbaud, which affected some charities in Canada. And so this is not an academic topic, Constantine just going on ad nauseum about. Vendor breaches was the other third of my events, because you're responsible when a vendor messes up. When somebody collects information under your name or authority, it's not their problem, it's your problem. So you need to know what information you're, first of all, sharing with them. Think about ways you can mitigate or minimize the information that you give them, but also think about what the consequences are of their errors, their breaches, because they will happen. Okay. I didn't want to neglect the fact that people talk. I've had to deal with events that came from simple gossip, talking out of turn, with not being. Of course, we've all witnessed, I'm sure, on the train or in different situations, people talking very loudly about stuff on the phone that they really should be not talking about. So we have to teach people not to do that. Social media is another way that happens, though, because people will reveal information. I had a situation in one of the organizations I worked for where somebody thought it was quite unusual that there was, like a $30,000 a month insurance policy quoted to somebody for home insurance. Well, they put it on Facebook. Bad idea, because of course that just gives anybody who wants to steal, for a living, a clue to where there's some really good stuff. So, there are consequences to sharing information on social media, and we have to teach people again, to be thoughtful about that. I mentioned paper already. Losing office property, typical situations, computers, how you got to think about how you're going to contend with that, because it will happen. And file sharing sites, be very careful of file sharing sites. If you are using a free service, it's like hiring a vendor and you have not gone through an appropriate review of that vendor. So it's very dangerous to just simply use, as I say, Dropbox or Box or whatever without having had some sort of formal agreement in place and, again, sticking to it. And we've said there's some solutions for some of those situations, right? Do vendor reviews, train, shred. MDM stands for mobile device management. That can be a little bit more of an expensive solution, but if you're relying on people to use devices, increasingly now with everyone remote working, think about how you could remotely deal with it if somebody lost a device or a computer. Use VPNs. And education, as I said, is the first best mitigation. So I'll stop talking and we'll throw it open to questions. Some have been coming in.
There are two questions in the chat box. The first one, and I'm just going to repeat it, from Corinne. Some funders ask for consolidated data with sensitive demographic information that's gathered via surveys. If we put a notification at the start of a survey to inform the participants and let them know why we are collecting this information and give them a choice to skip certain questions, is that sufficient?
Good question. So the basis, we have to you have to start really at the beginning. What's the basis for them getting this information? I mean, there may be valuable, it may be important for them, it may be a requirement for them, especially if they're public sector, to have certain information gathered. But yes, absolutely. If this is going to be shared with any third party, you want to let them know. If there's an opportunity for them, though, to skip questions, then that suggests to me maybe they're not mandatory or essential. So maybe what needs to be clear is that this is all voluntary, but you absolutely want to identify with whom it might be shared.
The second question is from Sean, saying, is it recommended to use a technology suite from one provider, for example, Google or Microsoft, so that data is stored with fewer direct actors, or is that hopeless?
Well, I don't think it's hopeless. I mean, I think that, again, it becomes a question of training and discipline. If you have an arrangement, say through Google, through your social purpose organization, that's going to be the platform you're going to use, then you should mandate and say, we're only going to use this one. Because if you're using any others, you can't have agreements with everybody, right? You'll be selecting one. And there's also the challenge, of course, with just training people, right? Microsoft does everything slightly differently than Google. I know because I have different clients saying we use Google, we use Microsoft, and I'm always running into challenges. You guys are using Teams, we use Teams, but others use Zoom and Cisco, and everything is slightly different. So whenever you have multiple, you increase the likelihood of messing up, right? So stick to one if you possibly can. Sometimes, again, like in my situation where clients expect me to use whatever that they're using, you have no choice. And you may be working, say, with different funders, but you can try and limit it, and especially with your volunteers and staff, so that again you keep their life simple, and that there's one place. But like I said, I think it's unlikely you're going to. I mean, some of the big providers will obviously make attractive arrangements for charities and for nonprofit organizations, and certainly leverage that, because you don't want to just simply have people using individual Google Dropbox box accounts. But I do think it's worthwhile trying to centralize on one. Again, just from the point of view of, I'm a big fan of the keep it simple principle.
I have a question. Is there any way, and I know government remains very concerned about this, is there any way that a consumer can inhibit a major service provider from engaging the kind of surveillance that I think they engage in? Or is it just going to be a fact of life unless the government is sophisticated enough to intervene?
Well, things are going to change in this country, and I think that's a great sort of point to finish on. The Europeans introduced their law 2 years ago, and it did create a sort of wave across the planet of people updating and changing their laws. The Canadian government is probably going to be introducing legislation, tabling legislation this fall. Quebec already has done so, and they want to go probably closer to the standards that are in the European General Data Protection Regulation. So we don't live in a static environment. The rules are going to change. The expectations are going to be raised. To answer your question, individual complaints have often driven change. Just a month ago, the Privacy Shield arrangement between Europe and the United States was completely upended, and it arose because of an individual's complaint. So there are changes coming, and complaints do make a difference. There are investigations going on right now you may be aware of Tim Hortons' use of data through its application, initiated by a complaint or actually by a news story. So these things do make a difference. Individual actions do account. We're very slow to change our law in this country, but it seems inevitable at this stage that our laws will change, both for public and private sector. And I do believe that your sector is going to be impacted by this, either directly or indirectly.
Thank you. I'd invite Corinne to formally close today's e-forum.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank you so much, Constantine. I don't know if you've been able to watch the comments, but this was an outstanding presentation. I believe we all learned so much. Thank you so much. This was very important to us. I just wanted to also remind everyone that if you are in the Peel region, please nominate your volunteers for the Oscars, and we will be providing access to the webcast and the resources that as the presentation and everything for you. I know we're out of time, and again, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today. We've got more very, very good sessions coming up, so please continue to join us. We do them weekly, and we usually do them at lunchtime every Thursday. So thank you very, very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Mindy, to answer your question, how to access the site, no, you don't have to be a member to access our dedicated COVID-19 versus COVID-19 webpage. If you go to volunteermbc.org, towards the right-hand side, you have the About section, and the very last sub-menu is the dedicated webpage. It says versus COVID-19.
Okay.
And my colleague Sean had shared it on the chat box as well.
So you guys are going to be sending that. You're going to be posting the slides, because unfortunately I got caught on something and I couldn't join right away.
Yes, we will be. We will be having the recording up on that site.
Thank you so much. That's great. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your week.
You too. That was good.
I know the colleagues are still on, but looking at next week, I guess my virtual fundraising template is not going to be a dream. It's going to be a reality.
Mhm.
I'll get on that right away.
Okay.
Okay, it's just